I can't remember anybody except the Queen.
The state banquet was meant to be an evening of composed smiles, immaculate protocol, and polished royal harmony. But in one breathless instant, Princess Catherine spotted the brooch resting on Camilla's gown, and the entire atmosphere inside that room shifted. It was Diana's brooch, not something resembling it, not a tribute piece. The very jewel that Catherine believed could never be worn without intention, approval, or genuine reverence. And what Catherine did next stunned everyone in that room. Before we go further into what this truly reveals about the royal family, make sure you subscribe so you never miss a single update. Catherine did not flinch. She did not look away. For several still seconds, the princess remained perfectly composed, as though her body had absorbed the blow before her mind could process it. Across the table, Camilla felt that steady gaze settle on her, firm and impossible to ignore, and the queen consort's fingers instinctively drifted toward the brooch, almost as a reflex. William registered the gesture first. The prince glanced between his wife and the jewel, and something inside him turned cold. This was no ordinary ornament. This was memory fastened to silk. This was grief put on public display. The banquet mattered because it was far from a routine dinner. A state banquet is a formal royal occasion hosted in honor of significant foreign guests, designed to project friendship, national strength, and sovereign dignity. Charles had needed the evening to look seamless. The king required unity following weeks of quiet, growing tension. He needed every person in that room to believe the family was still moving as a single, unbroken force. Catherine understood that completely. She knew the price of fracturing royal ceremony. But she also knew what silence would extract from her. If she remained quiet, Diana's name would once again disappear beneath layers of protocol. William slowly reached for Catherine's hand beneath the table, not to hold her back, but to ground her. She felt his touch and drew her hand away gently. That small movement told him everything he needed to know. The princess was not acting from anger. She was acting from something much deeper than that. Camilla looked down briefly, then raised her eyes again, and her expression shifted, because she understood in that instant that Catherine had recognized the brooch the moment she saw it. Charles had noticed it too. The king's composed expression tightened, and for the first time that evening, the control he had held so carefully began to fracture. The room continued breathing, but only just. Catherine rose from her chair, and the silence around her turned sharp. Staff members paused mid-step. Guests shifted their attention toward the head table. William stood half a beat later, close enough to make his support visible, far enough to allow her to speak for herself. Then the princess delivered an instruction no one had anticipated. She asked for the service to halt entirely. Camilla went still. Charles looked from Catherine to the queen consort, and in that exchange, the king knew the harm had already taken root. This was no minor breach of royal convention. This was Diana's shadow stepping back into the room through the one object no one had the right to use without deep consideration. And before those present could fully grasp why Catherine had brought everything to a standstill, the people closest to Diana's legacy began to understand precisely what was at stake. The brooch did not carry the same meaning for everyone seated in that hall. For Camilla, it represented a symbol of royal belonging. For Charles, it was a dangerous echo of a past he had never fully left behind. For William, it was his mother's presence returning at the most exposed moment imaginable. And for Catherine, it was a line crossed openly, beneath chandeliers, before the watching world. Catherine held herself still, but the pain had already reached her expression. She had spent years honoring Diana's memory with quiet care, never turning it into an instrument, never reaching for it to draw attention, never allowing grief to become something performed for an audience. That was precisely why this moment cut so sharply. Diana was not a name from a faded chapter of history. She was William's mother, the woman whose absence had quietly shaped his silences, his guardedness, and the way he shielded those he loved. William saw the brooch and his jaw tightened. The prince had always kept a quiet, intense watch over anything connected to Diana, especially pieces that held public significance. Royal jewelry, to him, was never merely decorative. A brooch in palace language could become a statement. And this particular piece carried a wound attached to it. A royal state event, a formal gathering where the family stands before foreign guests and diplomats as the face of the nation, was built to project unity. But one single object had turned that unity into something that ached. Camilla fought to keep her composure. She lifted her chin, held her posture straight, and carried herself as though nothing had shifted. But her hands gave her away. The queen consort touched the brooch once, then dropped her fingers quickly, as though she had only just realized that every eye near that table had tracked the motion. She had wanted acceptance. She had wanted the jewel to signal that old wounds had finally closed. Instead, it communicated something far colder, that someone else's pain had been borrowed without ever asking permission. Charles shifted in his seat, and the king's unease became impossible to ignore. He knew the history attached to the brooch, private conversations that had already split the family in ways the public never saw. He also knew that Catherine was not the kind of woman who challenged royal ceremony without cause. The monarch looked toward William, then toward Camilla, and his face carried the full weight of a past that had returned at the one moment he needed it gone. Catherine moved through sadness first, then shock, then something altogether stronger. She looked at William and understood he had seen exactly what she had seen. The prince needed no words. His silence was full of grief, and that grief gave her the strength to remain standing inside a room that expected her to simply sit back down and smile. Sophie registered the change before the others had fully understood it. The trusted confidant leaned quietly toward Catherine, her voice low, controlled, and edged with warning. She murmured that this was not the first time that Brooch had caused unease. Catherine did not reply, but her eyes told the whole story. William saw it. Charles saw it. Camilla felt it. That whispered sentence pulled the night backward to the private moment that had made Catherine's reaction unavoidable. This did not begin at the banquet table. It had started weeks earlier, inside a closed family gathering where Diana's personal pieces were being reviewed ahead of a planned memorial tribute. Catherine had made one simple request, that the brooch remain untouched until William decided where it belonged. But during that quiet ceremony, Camilla made a request of her own, and in doing so, turned a private memory into a fault line running through the entire family. Catherine remembered that day with sharp and painful clarity. The gathering at Kensington had been small, hushed, and deliberately shielded from outside attention. A memorial tribute, a planned public act designed to honor someone's life and legacy, was being arranged for Diana, and every detail carried emotional significance. William had walked into that meeting already carrying tension, because anything connected to his mother was never simply history to him. It was childhood. It was loss. It was the ache behind the royal composure. Sophie had sat close to Catherine, watching every movement with the careful steadiness of someone who understood how much pressure the family concealed. The trusted confidant knew the brooch was not simply another item in a royal collection, a term referring to the personal and official pieces kept by the family, used for ceremony, memory, and public meaning. When the sealed velvet case was placed on the table before them, Catherine looked at William first. The prince did not reach for it. He only looked at it, and his stillness told every person in the room that the piece still carried pain. Camilla had not been present for the first portion of that ceremony, but her name entered the room shortly after. According to a documented account later shared in a private palace briefing, she asked Charles whether she might wear Diana's brooch at the upcoming state banquet, as a gesture of reconciliation. The queen consort believed the jewel could demonstrate that old divisions had at last been put to rest. But Catherine understood the request very differently. To her, unity cannot be manufactured by taking another woman's grief and displaying it proudly before the world. William spoke to Charles that same evening. The prince told the king clearly that the brooch should remain unworn until he had personally determined its role in honoring Diana's legacy. Charles listened carefully, but he made no promise. That silence wounded Catherine more than a refusal ever could. She understood palace hesitation. She understood carefully chosen words. But this felt different. The monarch knew the object was deeply sensitive, and still he left the question open. Catherine learned of Camilla's request through Sophie, who relayed the details from a recorded conversation held with a senior aide. The princess was deeply unsettled, not because Camilla sought dignity, but because the queen consort seemed willing to draw that dignity from Diana without her family's blessing. William left that discussion visibly shaken, and Catherine watched him carry the pain silently, without complaint. That was why the banquet became unbearable. When Catherine saw the brooch fastened to Camilla's gown, she knew the private caution had been set aside. Charles had chosen silence. The queen consort had moved forward regardless. William had been left to face his mother's memory in public, without warning. So when Catherine rose from her chair, it was not impulse that moved her. It was the memory of a boundary that had been broken. The room did not erupt. It froze. Catherine did not raise her voice. She did not falter. She simply looked across the table at Camilla and asked one question that cut through every title, every rank, every carefully rehearsed smile. "Why are you wearing it?" The words were quiet, but they landed like a verdict. In that moment, the banquet ceased to be a royal occasion and became a family reckoning. Catherine stood while the service halted around her. A state banquet, in plain terms, is one of the monarchy's most formal dinners, held to honor important foreign guests and project the strength of the crown. That was what gave her decision such weight. She was not interrupting a private meal. She was pausing a carefully orchestrated symbol of national dignity, and every person present felt the gravity of it. Camilla attempted to respond with royal composure. She raised her chin, met Catherine's gaze, and began speaking as though the brooch were simply part of her evening ensemble. But her voice tightened before she reached the end of the sentence. The queen consort understood. The guests may not have grasped the full significance of the jewel, but the people who mattered did. Catherine knew. William knew. Charles knew. And that understanding made Camilla's composure feel brittle, almost hollow. William rose quietly beside Catherine. The prince did not speak over his wife, and he made no attempt to soften what she had said. He simply stood close enough for the room to understand she was not standing alone. His face carried the grief he rarely permitted anyone to witness. This was his mother's memory being handled before an audience, and he could not pretend it was merely an unfortunate choice of accessory. Diana's name was not spoken aloud, but it occupied every inch of silence between them. Charles leaned toward Camilla and told her quietly to remove it. The king did not raise his voice, but the instruction still reached across the table with force. Camilla hesitated, just one breath, one brief pause, and yet that pause altered everything. Catherine saw it, and her grief sharpened into disbelief. William saw it, and his expression hardened. The monarch saw it too, and his face darkened, because hesitation at that moment looked far too much like defiance. Catherine wanted dignity. She also wanted honesty. That was the conflict alive inside her. Part of her wanted to step back, take her seat, and shield the evening from scandal. Another part understood that silence would reduce Diana's pain to nothing more than decoration. So she held Camilla's gaze and refused to move. Camilla finally reached for the brooch, but the damage had already spread through the room. The queen consort's hand trembled slightly as she unfastened it, and that small tremor said more than any apology could have. She had been exposed before guests who had arrived expecting royal unity, and instead found a wound tearing open in real time, and stepped toward Charles with an expression carved in cold certainty. The Princess Royal did not offer comfort. She issued a warning. "This is no longer about jewelry," she said in a low voice. "This is about judgment." And once named the true problem, the palace stopped treating the banquet as an incident and began treating it as a crisis of authority. What lay beneath Catherine's quiet stand was something the palace could not dismiss: moral authority. She held no crown yet, no throne, no final say over royal protocol. But inside that room, Catherine possessed something more powerful than procedure. She held William's emotional trust, the guardianship of Diana's memory, and the public image of a future monarchy that could not survive being seen as heartless. Charles understood the shift before anyone had to name it. The king still wore the crown, and the crown represents the legal and public authority to lead the monarchy. But authority within a family can move before any title changes. That night, power did not rest solely with the monarch. It stood with Catherine, because she had defended a memory the country still held close. And William stood with her, because he knew silence would have been its own form of betrayal. Catherine sat alone in a side room afterward, hands folded, face composed, heart still aching. She chose not to walk back a single word she had said. The princess knew the palace would worry about appearances, foreign guests, headlines, and protocol, the strict rules governing royal conduct at official events. But for Catherine, the deeper obligation was human. Diana's legacy could not be picked up like a styling choice. It could not be borrowed for reassurance. It could not be placed on display to make old pain appear resolved. William stood near the closed door, turning each word over carefully before facing Charles. The prince did not accuse his father recklessly. He spoke with restraint, but the hurt beneath his voice was unmistakable. He told the king that Catherine had protected the family, not embarrassed it. She had prevented one painful moment from hardening into a permanent insult. Charles listened, and for once, the monarch had no easy answer waiting, and stepped in with sharper clarity. The Princess Royal stood behind Catherine without any ceremony, warning Charles that symbols can cut more deeply than statements ever could. A public speech can be walked back. A palace note can be rewritten. But a symbol, once seen, lives inside the mind. And knew this family had weathered scandal before, but she also knew that Diana's memory occupied different ground. It was not merely royal history. It was national grief. Camilla's team moved quickly to contain the damage. They framed the brooch as a gesture of reconciliation, a signal that the past and present had made peace. But Sophie dismantled that explanation with quiet precision. The trusted confidant reminded them that reconciliation cannot be imposed on those still grieving. If William had not agreed, if Catherine had not accepted it, then the gesture was not unity. It was pressure dressed in the language of grace. Charles looked down at the papers placed in front of him, then pushed them aside. The king knew that a palace access review, an examination of who had handled royal items and who had authorized their use, could reveal far more than anyone was prepared for. Still, he ordered it. Every piece connected to Diana had to be traced. Every authorization had to carry a name. That order changed the atmosphere instantly, because now the question was no longer why Camilla had worn the brooch. It was who had allowed it to happen. By midnight, the palace corridors were no longer quiet with the hum of ceremony. They were quiet with something closer to fear. Aides moved without speaking. Doors closed without sound. The banquet had resumed in appearance only. But everyone present understood the real event had already reached its end. Camilla had removed the brooch. Catherine had not returned to her original seat. And Charles was standing before a truth he could no longer delay. Charles gave the private instruction in a voice that left no room for debate. Diana's personal jewelry archive had to be fully reviewed before any future use was considered. A jewelry archive, in plain terms, is the carefully guarded record and storage of royal pieces, documenting where they are kept, who may access them, and when they are appropriate to wear. The king understood the weight of this order, because Diana's pieces were not ordinary palace property. They carried grief, public memory, and William's most deeply held family wound. Catherine sat apart from the main table, feeling no sense of victory whatsoever. The princess had halted the banquet, but in doing so had also drawn Diana's memory into a space filled with whispers, alarm, and frantic damage control. She had wanted respect, not spectacle. She had wanted the brooch safeguarded, not transformed into the center of a royal emergency. William stayed close beside her, and the prince understood that her strength was costing her far more than anyone around them could see. Camilla sat alone after the door closed behind her. The queen consort looked at the empty place on her gown where the brooch had been pinned, and that blank space felt more pronounced than the jewel itself had ever been. She had wanted the piece to speak of acceptance. Instead, it had spoken of hurt. She had wanted to appear settled and secure. Instead, the evening had left her exposed, questioned, and painfully aware that some symbols refused to serve the person wearing them. Palace staff prepared a composed explanation for the guests, a brief official account shaped to reassure without disclosing the full conflict. Charles knew such words might salvage the evening's surface, but they could not protect the family from the truth it had been forced to face. The king took the access file, read through the chain of approvals, then set it down without a word. William saw the same file shortly after, and his expression changed entirely. The prince had expected one private request, one poor decision, one lapse made under pressure. Instead, he discovered the brooch had passed through more hands than he had ever imagined. That revelation made the entire incident feel far less like an accident. It felt considered. It felt permitted. And that understanding cut deeper than anything else had that night. Catherine looked toward the closed door and arrived at her own decision. The princess did not request another palace briefing. She did not ask for more carefully worded explanations, more institutional language, or more insulation from the plain truth. She asked to speak to Camilla privately, without aides, without guards, without anyone present to translate pain into procedure. William heard the request and went still. Charles heard it and looked as though the evening had aged him. Camilla heard it and lowered her gaze. And in that private meeting, the knight finally stepped out from behind protocol and became something entirely human. There were no aides in the room, no prepared lines, no royal composure strong enough to conceal what the banquet had made visible. Catherine and Camilla stood before one another, not as future queen and queen consort, but as two women living in the long shadow of Diana. For the first time that night, the anger gave way to something far more difficult to manage. Honesty. Catherine entered the private sitting room with her face composed but her heart still heavy. A private sitting room, in simple terms, is a smaller royal space used for personal conversations away from formal guests and public ceremony. That distinction mattered, because this was the first place all evening where no title could protect anyone. Camilla could not hide behind the grandeur of the banquet. Catherine could not retreat into silence. The pain had followed them both through the door. William waited outside, choosing not to interfere yet unable to walk away. The prince understood this exchange belonged to Catherine, but the brooch belonged to a wound that had quietly shaped his entire life. Charles also held back. The king recognized that if he stepped inside, the moment would become about authority again, and this was no longer a matter authority could resolve. It had to be human, or it would mean nothing at all. Catherine looked at Camilla and spoke with quiet sadness. She told the queen consort that the brooch had no place in a performance of unity, because Diana's memory still carried living grief. The princess did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Every word landed with greater force because it arrived without anger. She explained that unity cannot be assembled by wearing something fastened to another woman's suffering. It has to be built carefully, over time, with genuine respect. Camilla attempted to defend herself at first. She said she had wanted the gesture to signal acceptance, to show that old wounds had begun to heal and the family could finally move forward together. But even as she spoke, her voice lost its footing. Catherine listened, then replied with a truth that broke through the room. Acceptance cannot be taken from someone else's grief. It cannot be pinned to a gown and offered up as peace. Camilla looked down. The defensiveness drained away and something much closer to shame filled its place. She reached for the case holding the brooch, opened it carefully, and lifted the jewel as though it had grown heavier in her hands during the course of the evening. Then the queen consort placed it on the table between them and said she would not wear it again. Catherine did not smile. She only nodded, because the promise could not undo the wound, but it could prevent the wound from being reopened. Camilla understood that now. Catherine understood it too. William stepped inside moments later and saw the brooch resting on the table between them. The prince did not ask what words had been exchanged. He did not need to. Catherine's expression told him the confrontation had transformed into something else entirely. Camilla's silence confirmed the same. And in that quiet, the night found its turning point. But beyond the palace walls, the private meaning of what had taken place was already becoming something far larger and louder. By morning, the monarchy's private wound had become a national conversation. The image was everywhere: Camilla seated in diamonds, Catherine standing at the banquet table, William watching with a face that held everything he refused to say aloud. No official explanation could compete with what the public believed they had witnessed. Diana's memory had walked back into the room, and Britain responded as if an old and unfinished heartbreak had been pried open again. Catherine's name was on everyone's lips before breakfast. A major newspaper ran the close banquet photograph beneath one devastating headline: "The brooch that stopped the palace." A newspaper front page, in plain terms, is the first image people encounter before reading a single word inside. And this one mattered, because it pulled a private royal clash into the full light of public judgment. Catherine was not portrayed as reckless. She was portrayed as a protector. The public saw a woman who stood for Diana in a room that expected her to stay quiet. William grasped the risk of it immediately. The prince understood that public sympathy can be a force, but it can also peel back wounds the family had spent years carefully managing. Outside Kensington Palace, a small gathering of people left white flowers near the gates as a quiet, wordless tribute. Kensington mattered because it remained so deeply connected to Diana's life, and the flowers transformed the story from something resembling gossip into something that felt unmistakably like grief. Meanwhile, Camilla faced the public response with visible strain. The Queen Consort appeared subdued as she stepped out from a private chapel service later that day, and the cameras caught the heaviness settled across her expression. She had wanted acceptance. The public saw disrespect. She had wanted unity. The country began asking why Diana's memory had been placed on her gown without the clear and willing blessing of William or Catherine. Charles moved quickly, but even the king could not slow the emotional momentum of what had been set in motion. He approved a palace statement confirming new restrictions on the handling of items personally connected to Diana. A palace statement is an official release designed to shape public understanding and manage reaction. But this particular statement carried a meaning beyond its careful words. It signaled that the monarchy acknowledged a line had been crossed. It also signaled that Catherine's stand had produced a real and lasting consequence. A broadcaster captured the entire situation in a single line that spread across every platform almost immediately. This was not a jewelry mistake. It was a memory mistake. That sentence cut through every measured explanation. It gave people the words they had already been feeling. Diana was not a closed chapter of royal history. She remained a living presence inside Britain's emotional memory. And Catherine had defended that presence at the exact moment it seemed most vulnerable. Camilla heard the reaction and retreated further into silence. Catherine heard it and felt no impulse to celebrate. William heard it and understood that the landscape ahead had changed again. The public had not turned away from the monarchy. It had looked directly at the crown and asked it to do better, to honor the woman it had never truly let go. And when the noise gradually quieted, one truth remained standing inside the palace, sharper than any official communication could have expressed. The banquet had ended, but its meaning refused to fade. It became the night Catherine demonstrated that loyalty to the crown does not mean silence. It means recognizing when dignity has been compromised. Camilla lost the standing to treat Diana's memory as a symbol of convenience. Charles was forced to accept that old wounds cannot be managed through protocol alone. And William watched Catherine become the guardian of something that ran deeper than tradition. Catherine reached her decision by morning, and it carried no trace of revenge. The princess did not seek further humiliation for Camilla. She did not ask for a public consequence or another scene played out before an audience. She asked for one clear and lasting boundary, that Diana's most personal pieces would never again be used without the full agreement of the family. A private protocol, simply put, is an internal royal arrangement that determines how sensitive matters are handled beyond the reach of public view. This particular arrangement mattered because it placed grief above image and human respect above convenience. William supported the boundary without hesitation. The prince saw it as protection for his mother's memory, but also as the foundation for the kind of monarchy he intended to lead. He understood that the crown cannot ask the country to trust it while treating grief like an aesthetic choice. He understood that Catherine had done something many around her lacked the courage to do. She had halted a royal event, not to fracture the family, but to preserve the part of it that still answered to something higher than image. Charles approved the new arrangement in heavy silence. The king understood that the brooch had uncovered something far larger than a single mistake. It had revealed how quickly palace control can unravel when human feeling is overridden. He had spent years attempting to navigate old wounds through precise timing, measured language, and choreographed ceremony. But Diana's memory had never once submitted to palace management. It lived inside William. It lived inside Catherine's protection of him. It lived inside the public heart. Camilla accepted the new arrangement without resistance. The queen consort understood that the brooch had cost her far more than the dignity of one evening. It had reminded her that acceptance cannot be demanded, and that peace cannot simply be worn like a piece of jewelry. She had wanted the symbol to close an old chapter. Instead, it had proved the chapter was still tender, still guarded, and still capable of shaking the foundations of the room. And found Catherine later and spoke with blunt kindness. The Princess Royal told her that what she had done was not defiance. It was stewardship, the act of protecting something of lasting value for the sake of the future. And Catherine, hearing those words, finally found a measure of peace. Not because the pain had disappeared, but because she had refused to allow it to be treated as if it did not exist. The monarchy survived the banquet because Catherine stopped it. That was the final and enduring truth. She did not weaken the crown. She reminded it what it means to carry dignity. The future of this institution will not be constructed by burying the past. and Diana's memory will not be used to decorate anyone else's need for validation. No further question remained, only the lasting image of Catherine rising from her chair when every expectation in that room said stay seated, and in doing so, redefining what royal duty truly means. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.